If you've ever bought a set of gradient yarn or had one at home or had a set where you thought it would make a nice gradient but didn't know how to use it, well, this is the video for you. In this Ask a Knitters video, we're going to take a look at some pattern ideas that work really well with all sorts of different type gradient yarns, and hopefully we'll give you some ideas on ways you can use those yarns. Now, a lot of this comes from a book I wrote a few years ago called Knitting with Rainbows, and most of the patterns I'm going to talk about will refer to patterns from this book, because in this I went through a couple of basic different gradient pattern styles that you will have and how you can actually make the most use out of those and how you combine them together so it works seamlessly. Because if you've picked up a gradient set, like often you might pick it up at a fibre festival or even in a yarn shop, and it just looks so beautiful the way they're displayed. They're often in boxes with all of them next to each other or a package, and it looks too perfect to knit with. And that's actually what inspired the book, because I was the same. I had all of these different gradient sets sitting at home and I was a little intimidated to use them because the yarn itself it just looks so perfect. The way it was put together is the best way to describe it. So what I ended up doing with the book is I broke it down into three basic types. You've got gradient sets, which are mini skeins, either ones you've bought or perhaps assembled yourself at home, where the colours are really close to each other. So when you put one next to each other, there's a very obvious gradient of the colours as they move along. So the Mardyke one here is a good example of that. So this was super mini skeins, like tiny ones, where I put them next to when you put them next to each other, it made a very, very subtle gradient, then went all the way from, you can see a very bright yellow colour all the way up to a deep brown. But they were all individual little skeins. Now, when I was using it, the main thing I did before I got started is I actually just went ahead and I did a Russian join, because this is superwash, so you can't do a felted join. I did a Russian join, joining them all together, making one continuous yarn with it. But the advantage of having them as individual skeins like that is if you wanted to make this bigger and you needed more, what you can actually do is get two of the set and then join two of each colour as you move along. So suddenly you've got twice the length of each section of the gradient and it works really well together. So that's definitely the advantage of having all of the skeins separate, even though there's a lot of different yarns to join. So that's one where they're very different, and you need to be able to make a continuous colour out of it. The next one would be in the same category because you've got individual skeins of yarn, but they're really more, how can I put it, complementary colours than a true gradient. This one falls a little bit like that. It's like you're taking this gradient with all of the multiple small variations in tone and took out sections. So this one went from this, over to the next one, but then it morphed right over to oranges and to reds. So there was really big jumps between each of them. So it's a gradient as such, but it wasn't a very subtle one. So with that, you got to take a few different ideas on how you would work it. And then the third kind that you can get is, I'll show you here, is Shanacheel is the name of this scarf, but it was done with a gradient that came as a single ball of yarn. So when you wound it up, it goes all the way from one colour very slowly onto a next colour. And in this case, it went from that kind of purpley colour all the way up to the pale or the brighter yellow colours here. So I developed a couple of different ways of working with each of these types. The first one is if you've got a huge variation in colours, what you can actually do is something with a slip stitch pattern. So when you're working with slip stitch patterns, what I'm wearing here, take a look at this cowl. So what you can do with slip stitch patterns is you can take ones with lots of nice contrast and you can blend them in together, so that it means that they're kind of, one can then merge into another, but you're not trying to make it look like it's subtle. You're deliberately making it so each of those jumps in color has got a job to do. So I'm just pausing the video for a second to remind you that if you're enjoying the video, give us a thumbs up down below, because that way we know which videos you're liking and we'll make sure that we make more of them. So back to the video now. So I've got another pattern here where this is a little bit more subtle. This one is, let me remind myself of the name, this is Fen's Key. So what this one is, this was a more subtle gradient, but what I've actually done with it is I've also introduced breaking points. So you could actually have a contrast color, for instance. So you could have one set of gradient and one solid color that works well with all of it. And then you can do divisions between each of these. So you could have the gradient for the patterns between, and then the actual pattern that divides it, you can have as a contrast color. And you'll also notice something else here. With gradients, I often try to work into wave patterns. So you don't have solid line divisions from one into another. You can actually have it where there's a nice little bit of a wave in the pattern, and that works really nicely when you've got a gradient going from one to another. The other thing with this one here is the first division. You can see this is called Dragon Flames, and it's a cardigan that starts in the middle, works out, and then comes up over the front. So the first one here, I went straight. I tried going first of all with the waves, but the jumps between the colors were too much. It wasn't working very well. So then I went over here, and going between this and this, I did a variation on a fade basically. So with the fade, what you're doing is you're taking two colors that look nice together. They're not exactly the same. There's an obvious jump. And you take a section between them where you're alternating a couple of rows in each one. So you're gradually allowing it to fade from one into another. So you can kind of create a gradient or a mix of colors between the two as you go through. This one here, not quite a fade because, well, the fade is actually the yarn itself. But what I wanted to do was to take that one skein of yarn that went from one color all the way up to the other, and basically create the contrast with its own colors. So what I did with this is it starts over here in the tip with one color, and then the contrast color was actually taking the tail of the same skein of yarn, because it was a really big one, and using that as a contrast. So as you're working through, you're getting less and less contrast, because by the time you get down to the edge here, you're in the middle of it, so you're joining the kind of more yellow and the more purple end of it. So those big gradients work, particularly if it's a big skein, work really nicely by being able to use both tails of it. So you can pull a slip stitch pattern in like this to use as a contrast, but you're using the same yarn to contrast in itself. Taking a look at some other wave patterns that you can do, the way we can get a nice little bit of contrast with the wave. This one is Sunday as well, and it's a big oversized hat, and it was mini skeins where you can see it goes from one to the next to the next to the next. And you see here, by actually adding in a wave pattern, I'm not trying to divide or not trying to hide the fact that you're going from one color to the other, but I'm just trying to create a nice interesting shape just by using an actual stitch pattern that effectively creates waves by having increases and decreases as you work your way along through that. So there was one more technique that I wanted to show you. This one is Forge Hill. So this is, I'm going to show you on the side here. So this one just took 3 full-size skeins of yarns where I was trying to merge them in together, going from one to another. And it is a variation on a fade, because what you're actually doing is, this had a very light fingering weight yarn and I'm holding it double. So when you start off, you hold these 2 colors double first of all. Then you want to basically create a fade when you go into the next, and you drop out one of that pink color and you bring in this lighter color. So you've got one strand of each to create this contrast or this blending between them. Then you move into 2 strands of that middle one, and then you drop one of those strands and you bring one of the purple color, and then you end with the double strand of the purple. So it's a great way if you've got a pattern that needs a much heavier yarn and you'd like to be able to fade colors that don't obviously look like they should go together. Holding a double stranded actually allows you to create this effect going through. So this was a scarf that was knit from side to side to allow you to create this fade, where you've got both those strands being dropped in and taken out as you go through. And I've also done a big wave effect here, where you've got lots of increases and decreases, so that the whole thing is waving along rather than being very solid lines as you divide through. So hopefully these have given you some ideas on things you can use for gradients with. So the first thing you want to look at is figure out what kind of a gradient you've got, because that will determine what kind of a stitch pattern is going to work well with it. Then you can look from the book that I've shown you here on different pattern ideas. The ones in the book are all accessories and smaller ideas, but you can obviously take that technique and pull it into an actual garment or a bigger item. So if it's big contrast, slip stitch works well. Anything where you've got some nice waves going helps break up the lines going through. If you want to create a more subtle variation from one to another, go for wave stitch patterns, go for morphing, blending in, fading from one color into the other. And then the last idea is, if you've got ones where it's only small sections of mini skeins, pull in a contrast color that you can use for dividing lines, so it'll allow you go from one color to another with that, I suppose, the solid contrast color acting as a cohesive joiner to bring the whole thing together. So hopefully you got some ideas on how you can use your gradient yarns. Don't leave them sit on the shelf, get them out and start knitting them.